Have you ever had a fair weather friend? You know, the kind of friend who promises their unfailing loyalty to you, pledges their love to you through thick and thin. And then when the tough gets going, they get going. Hopefully you've had some real friends, true friends, who when the tough gets going, that's when they show up. They're there for you through thick and thin. A fair weather friend is no friend at all. Their love doesn't run deep. A true friend is a friend who shows up, who is there with you through it all. One of the most frequent questions I get asked, actually it's usually put more in the form of a statement, a declaration, is if I already believe in a God of love, why do I need Jesus? Why do I have to believe in Jesus? Why does Jesus matter? And while there are many things to say about that, not least of which is that we need Jesus for salvation, the simple answer, without getting into a lot of depth about how Jesus saves us, the simple answer, the most basic answer, the most fundamental answer, which meets the question or the statement on its own terms, is this, is that if you don't have Jesus, you don't have a God of love. Without Jesus, you can't have a God of love. Without believing in Jesus, you can't believe in a God of love. Because without Jesus, without Emmanuel, God with us, to the radical degree that Jesus is with us, becoming fully human, God is like a fair weather friend, a transcendent God who has never experienced the things that we go through in our full humanity, is a distant God, a God who really isn't with us. As we're about to celebrate Christmas, what Christmas really is all about is Emmanuel, God with us, the incarnation, God taking on flesh and blood. Christians celebrate the fact that God is with us in this event, the event of the incarnation, and to the most radical degree possible. As Hebrews says, Hebrews 4, Jesus is like us in all things but sin. Or Philippians 2, Jesus actually gave up his divine prerogatives, though he was in the form of God. He took on the form of a human being, even a servant, a slave, and then went to a death, the most debased death possible, on the cross. He emptied himself of all those divine prerogatives, something we can't do because we're not God, but he emptied himself of all those divine prerogatives in order to become fully human. Though his identity still was divine, he was still the eternal Son of God, he lived a fully human life. Though he was omniscient, all-knowing, he freely gave up that omniscience. That's why you see Jesus praying so much. He has to pray to the Father and rely on the Father and trust the Father the way we do, the way we have to go to God to discern what God's will is for our lives, or to seek comfort or a communion with God, or the ability to do the things that God is calling us to do. When Jesus exercised omniscience during his public ministry, when he exercised supernatural power, it was because he was depending on the Father to provide him with that. He had freely given up that omniscience that no human being has. That's why in Mark 13:32, Jesus but he states that he doesn't know the day or the hour of the end time. Only the Father knows. Jesus was limited in his knowledge the way that we are. Though he was all powerful, omnipotent, Jesus became vulnerable. He became a weak and fragile human being from the moment that he was born into this world as a helpless baby. But throughout his life, he lived a life of self-sacrifice, the life of a servant. He didn't live as a king in nobility, having people serve him hand and foot. He lived the life of a servant. Though he was eternal, though he was immortal, he suffered death. He experienced death, a dreadful death, the most horrific torture devised at that time, and one of the worst tortures ever devised by human beings in the history of the world. He experienced that, and in the moments leading up to that, the day before at least, and probably even before that, Jesus, think about the agony in the garden, experienced the same dread, the same terror we have in the face of death. For us, death is so dreadful, terrifying, because it's the ultimate unknown. Jesus had that same sense. He had to rely on the Father. He had to trust the Father that he would vindicate him, that he would raise him up 3 days later. If Jesus in that moment knew for sure, had no doubts that he was going to be raised 3 days later, then death wouldn't have been all that problematic for him. It wouldn't have created that agony, that that angst. Sure, it would have been awful going through the crucifixion, but he wouldn't have pleaded with the Father to let that pass him by. If he knew that it was the doorway to far greater glory, then it wouldn't have been easy for him, but it would have been much different than the way we experience death. But no, the agony in the garden, that story tells us that Jesus had the same dread of death, the same fear and terror that we feel in the face of death, our greatest nemesis, our greatest enemy. Jesus emptied himself of all his divine prerogatives so that he could be with us to the most radical degree possible, like us in all things but sin. He was fully human, real flesh and blood. And that's what a God of love, if God really is love, has to do. I mean, it's logically necessary for God to do that if he loves us, to be with us. Otherwise, a God who never experiences the limitations of knowledge because he's omniscient, a God who is so all-powerful that he never experiences human vulnerability, a God who is eternal and immortal and has no idea what it's like to experience death or to just dread it, to fear it, is a God who really isn't with us at all. Have you ever noticed how good it feels to have somebody really listen to you, be present to you, even in the midst of some of your darkest and most difficult times, even though those circumstances may not change? Maybe they can't change. Maybe you just lost a loved one. Maybe you're going through a breakup in a relationship that is never going to be reconciled again. Maybe it's something that's permanent, that can't be changed. But whatever the circumstances, no matter how difficult they are, when you find somebody, a faithful friend, who will sit there and listen to you, it feels good. It changes things. It's healing in some profound way that's hard to put words on. It's transformative, even perspective altering when that happens. And even more than that, when somebody listens to you who's gone through a similar kind of experience, it's even more healing. It's even more transformative. As a pastor, I had many encounters over the years. First, working in a shelter where I encountered a lot of people who were combat veterans, a lot of the homeless who were combat veterans who would share their experience with me. And I felt so unable to help them. I mean, it felt good for them, I think, that had somebody that gave them a listening ear. But I hadn't gone through that experience. And so not having gone through that experience, it wasn't as helpful to them as if they could talk to somebody who could understand completely what they had gone through. There's this great book by Henry Nouwen, classic book called The Wounded Healer, and the premise is that the people that can help heal other people best are people who've gone through it themselves, who've been wounded in the same way. Only somebody who is a combat veteran, who's been through combat, can really help somebody who's struggling with it themselves. As I found out as a pastor, beyond my experiences in the shelter, in dealing with people who've gone through combat, again, I'm not the right person to really help them out. But what, over the intervening years, since way back when I was working in the shelter almost 30 years ago, over the intervening years, what has been found is that the most helpful thing for combat veterans who are struggling with the hell of war that they experience is to have other veterans who've gone through that, to talk to them, to simply have that kind of relationship, that kind of wounded healer helping them, enabling them to kind of turn things around. So many of the people that I met who were broken by their combat experience, that's the only thing that will really help them. But think about how powerful that is. It's not erasing what happened. You can't. It's not providing some kind of sophisticated psychological therapy. It's not drug treatment or anything else. It's simply having somebody present to you, who's with you, who will accompany you, who will sit and truly listen to you, be with you, who understands what you've gone through because they've been there themselves. That's what Emmanuel is all about, God with us. The God of the universe, the transcendent God in Jesus, becomes like us in all things so that he truly gets us. He understands what it's like to be us. He's been through every experience that we've been through. When I was a firefighter, over the years, we had a number of fatal fires. And after those fires, traumatic incidents, we would have a critical incident debriefing. And usually the fire department would bring in people who were professionals, who were professional counselors. And they did a good job, but those sessions really weren't helpful to us as firefighters. One of the worst fires we ever went to was a fire where two young kids, grandchildren and a grandmother, it was Martin Luther King holiday, and the grandchildren were staying with the grandmother the night before, and their apartment caught on fire. And the heartbreaking thing for us, every death in a fire was heartbreaking, but the worst thing about that one was we were so close to getting them out. Now, nothing would have changed the outcome, but it was so close, moments away from being able to actually save them. It's the hardest thing for an emergency worker, firefighter, is when you know that you came that close to saving them, because you second guess everything you did. What if you did things just a little bit faster? Could you have saved their lives? That was the toughest fire I remember going through, dealing with those kinds of questions. But in that critical incident debriefing, I remember that was an early morning fire that night. They did the debriefing. In that debriefing, they didn't have professionals come in and talk to us. They had other firefighters who have been trained in counseling, doing critical incident debriefing. But they were fellow firefighters who had been there, who had done the job, who understood what it was like to go to a fire and have somebody die when you were so close to being able to save them. That session was so helpful, so healing. Not just the fact that we could talk to fellow firefighters who understood what we were going through, but it started a conversation among ourselves where even after that debriefing, we could talk to one another, because we tend not to talk about those kinds of fires. We tend to bottle it in. But it enabled us to talk to one another in a way that was so powerful, so healing. Having somebody who will be there listening to you, who understands you, who's been there before, but who sticks with you through thick and thin, that is so powerful, so transformative. One of the most profound experiences we can have in life. And if there is a God who loves us, then that God must be willing to do all of that, to be with us through thick and thin, to understand us, to do what it takes to really understand us, to get us, to walk in our shoes, to know what it's like to be in our skin. And that means for God, for the eternal, transcendent, infinite God, he must take on human flesh, become flesh and blood, do all that Jesus does in the incarnation to truly be Emmanuel, to truly love us. Otherwise, he's no better than a fair weather friend. But if you've ever been in the position of trying to help somebody out who's going through a difficult time, you've tried to be there for a friend. When you do that, it costs you something. For one, it just costs you your time. Time is precious. We're all very busy. So it takes a lot of time to sit with somebody through their difficult and dark times, dark periods. But it's also hard just to listen, because we want to fix things. We want to enter in, swoop in and come in and try to fix things, make everything right. And to just sit and listen is hard, because then you have to kind of bear the other person's burden. And that's probably the most difficult thing of it all. Not simply the sacrifice of time, not simply just being present, trying to just be attentive and listen to the person and not try to fix their situation, oftentimes situations you can't even fix, but to just sit there and listen, because that's really hard. But the hardest thing of all is that you end up carrying their burden, shouldering their burden. That's what helps them so much, is they're able to somehow unload it and to have somebody walk with them, help them carry it. But that means you don't walk away from those conversations the same. If you've really done that for somebody, for a friend, if you've been with them in those difficult and darkest times of their lives, you know that when you walk away from that, you walk away carrying their burden. You can't just shut your mind off to what you've heard. You now truly do carry their burden. It costs you to do that. It's no different for God, except that the cost for God was infinite in measure. The cost for us is finite, always finite, but the cost for God was infinite. Because in order for Jesus to be Emmanuel, to be with us, to understand us, to get us inside and out, to really walk with us, walk in our shoes, be like us in all things but sin, to be fully human, he had to give up his divine prerogatives. He had to give up those prerogatives that gave him perfect bliss in heaven, in paradise. Most of all, gave him that communion with the Father and the Spirit, that perfect love which he had throughout all eternity. He had to give all of that up in order to be with us, to be Emmanuel. And yet, That's how much he loves us. He loves us. He loves you. He loves me that much. To give up those divine prerogatives, those infinite blessings of perfect bliss, of perfect communion in the Trinity, of the divine life. He gave all that up to live a life where he was ignorant, limited in knowledge, a life where he was vulnerable, powerless, where he had to live the life of a servant and be hungry and tired and thirsty, a life where he had to taste death, where he had to experience that dread of death, fear and angst and agony, all the things that we go through. He gave up his divine prerogatives where he was totally above all of that, totally transcended all of that to enter into our reality. That's how much he loves you. That's how much he loves me. And that is an awesome thought. In fact, it's the most awesome thought there is. And so as we approach Christmas, I pray that you have the most blessed of Christmases, that your Christmas is everything you could desire it to be and more. But above all, I pray this Christmas that you will take some time to meditate on that, to meditate on how much God loves you and how profoundly healing that can be when you understand that the Lord of the universe is with you, really with you, understands you better than you understand yourself. And what drove him to do that was this incredible, unspeakable love of his. May this Christmas, may that sink in more deeply than it's ever sunk in before. If you've never believed it, if you're very skeptical of that, I pray that this Christmas you'll open your heart to it so that you might taste and see the goodness of the Lord, so that you might experience Emmanuel, God with us, God with you, like a good, faithful friend who is there in difficult times, but more so, it's the Lord of the universe who is there with you, the one who was wounded for our sake so that he could heal us in the deepest way possible, the ultimate wounded healer. May you know the glory of Emmanuel this Christmas. Merry Christmas.